hear from enrollment and assessment later on. We were going to get an update today on the new economy workforce credential grant program. We were going to hear from a number of individuals, so if you guys would also come up, I think then we're going to put you in these 4 chairs. Is that okay? Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Talking to us about this important items. We'll let you guys go. Sarah, you want to go first? Is that
First on the agenda, sir, thank you. All right, can everyone hear me? So my name is Sarah Dunnigan. I'm the Executive Director of the State Workforce Board. I'd like to thank the committee for having us on the agenda, and the purpose of me being here today is just to explain a little bit about the role of the Workforce Development Board in supporting the Workforce Credential Grant Program. So it was directed that the board was going to do something that was, I think, fairly significant, and that is to develop a list of demand occupations that were going to serve as a guide, a beacon, if you will, for the approved credentialing programs which would be offered by the eligible institutions. We did a lot of research prior to embarking on this process. We looked at best practices in other states, including Florida, Pennsylvania, Texas, Illinois, that are really looking at how we can make more strategic investments in workforce development around critical demand occupations. The task force, again, which is a subcommittee of the board, has co-chairs, and let me just mention the leadership there: Delegate Kathy Byron and Jeannie Armentrout. Jeannie is with Carillion Healthcare Systems in Roanoke. The vice chair is Nat Marshall. Nat's with BWXT in Lynchburg. And rounding out the committee is Senator Ruff, Ray Bagley with Newport News Shipbuilding, Thomas Bell with the Iron Workers Union, Lane Hopkins, who's with Harris Williams, which is a financial service investment firm, Carrie Roth with the Virginia Biotechnology Research Park, Brett Bassey with the Virginia Manufacturers Association, Tom Walker, who represents an IT and drone company over in the Virginia Beach area. We brought in some additional perspectives, including workforce team members from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, a gentleman by the name of Neil Ridley, who's with Georgetown University, who has been doing a lot of really important research on skills gaps and demand occupations, particularly in this middle skills area. And then finally, Ann Battle, and Ann is with the Richmond Fed. And the Fed, she's an economist there, and so we really wanted to create kind of a round committee with perspective. We started with the priority occupations, which were in the New Virginia Economy Strategic Plan. And we wanted to make sure that this initiative certainly supported those growth-oriented industries, and specifically the need for skilled technicians and middle skills jobs. We looked at some ancillary industries. We included construction as well. So information technology, energy, advanced manufacturing, life sciences, logistics, healthcare, agriculture and forestry, and professional business services were the industry sectors. Then we started looking at occupations. Now, there are actually 840 different occupations that the Bureau of Labor Statistics recognizes by name, and they've got a taxonomy. We took those major occupation groups, which were most closely related to the industries that the committee identified and selected, which were 11 groups, and we reviewed labor market data, which was provided to us by the Virginia Employment Commission. We're looking at long-range projections, recognizing that these are, we're looking for sustained periods of demand. So we screen them to isolate jobs that require some type of advanced skill requirement. So you won't see jobs on the list, for example, that don't require typically some post-secondary education. Jobs which you could attain, fast food is an example, retail hospitality. There aren't jobs like that on the list. I just want to make a point there. And we're looking for some type of industry recognized post secondary credential. Certification, license, or journeyman's card, those are all examples of credentials that we wanted this program to help support. So we supported on jobs that had projected growth, jobs that we're going to need more than 50 or more jobs filled statewide, And that led us to a list of about 166 occupations, down from that 840. Now, I just want to note that because we just looked at those 11 major groups, we recognize that some of these education programs would prepare people for multiple jobs in the cluster. So I don't want folks to get frustrated and think, gosh, 166 jobs is too many. It's really 11 career clusters, and looking to, because there's skills bundles, if you will, within each of those clusters. That list was advanced to the Virginia Board of Workforce Development for approval. So the task force did its job. They developed an overview, which I think was included in your packet, of the methodology, produced the list. We also have a petitioning process so that if there is an occupation not on our list and there's unmet industry demand, groups of employers can petition to have their job added. And I think that's really important to recognize too, because there's emerging industries and occupations that we just don't really know and understand yet. So the task force meets annually to review its methodology, the list. We have, since year one, received some new labor projections data from the BEC and incorporated that. It did mean that some jobs fell off the list because their growth trajectory had changed and they didn't meet the thresholds that we had originally developed. And the board continues to work on really starting to understand more clearly the difference, the relationship between the supply of labor in Virginia and the demand, right, for labor. And I think this Workforce Credential Grant Program was developed in part to help us address that gap. So we have been having some discussions. As you know, there was a JLARC report on the community college system, and there were some recommendations specific to the Workforce Credential Grant Program. Tracy's going to share more with you about that report. But suffice to say, the board took those recommendations in response, and the task force met in November to discuss, again, the methodology, whether or not we needed to revisit some of the screening tools that we used to develop the list. We looked again at some best practices and state models just to become reinformed. Our next meeting is going to be in late February, early March, still to be scheduled. Of course, all our meetings are open, so if anybody here has special interest in watching us work, we encourage you to come. And the one thing that the task force, when they met in November, did discuss was the board taking a bigger role in developing regional demand lists, okay? So our first pass out, this was a statewide list. You know, we recognize that economies are regional. And so I believe that the task force is going to look at creating companion lists, if you will. There'll be a statewide list, and then there will be regional demand occupation lists to help inform the program at the regional level.
I'm just curious, will you keep as many occupations regionally? Or will you shorten the list and make it more specific, or you'll just keep the same number?
Sure. So I think what we recognize is that there may be a demand in one at the state level, which we pick up using our process, but there may be no demand for that occupation in a certain part of Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, for example. So the regional list would show, yes, it is on the state list, but regionally there is not demand for this occupation.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add, each community college is required to look at their catchment area and decide what to do. So it may be on the statewide list, but it may be relevant.
And Mr. Herndon will describe a little further, Dr. Herndon, I'm sorry, right? The process that the community colleges use to really do that vetting with a lot of input from business and industry.
Questions? Maybe Frank has done a lot of the work on this along with Kelly Broward. When you think about some of the higher level ones, like the civil engineering, chemical engineering, how does this grant affect that? Why is it this, the grant get to it?
Sure. So there are some certifications in professional fields, so even within engineering, for example, but typically you have to have a bachelor's degree plus. It's a bachelor's plus. I will tell you, we included engineering and life sciences because they were related to the target industries. There are no programs that are on the list of eligible programs for funding. So I think when we get back together, there's gonna be, a winnowing of the list, and the committee's gonna determine the process for that, but I think that's very intuitive, and it's something we've learned as we've kind of come down the road.
Mr. Chairman, just one more question for you, Sarah, and that is, in early childhood development, we have looked at the importance of training that workforce so that they can prepare the workforce of the future, and how important it is. And I know for a while they thought that their education was not on here and that they couldn't use this funding. We established that it is. Do you have programs set up for that, or has there not been any demand?
I'm not familiar with any non-credit workforce training programs around early childhood development, but we do recognize that the teacher shortage is acute and significant, even in the early childhood space, but I don't recall that there are any approved programs in the early childhood education space at this time approved for funding.
Let me add to that, in quicker college system, currently, the demand we see in regions has been for credit-based instruction leading to an applied associate degree. And so if the industry identifies as a short-term industry recognized certification license, I suspect that we will all find the demand in most corners of the Commonwealth.
Mr. Chairman, is there not a short 12 credit early childhood education program through the community colleges?
There is, yes.
That would be the foundation for early childhood development. We could just get everybody to get that.
Yes.
It wouldn't be bad. So is that just not an approved program, or?
Great question. It's delivered through credit instruction, so it's already subsidized through the state through the FTE model.
So they wouldn't be eligible for any?
It's under this design.
Any other questions? Yeah, sure, that's great.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. As Sarah talked a little bit about what the board's role is, I'm here with the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, and to talk to you a little bit about what our role has been in this program. When it was established, we were set up as the administrator of the grant, and I've got them here. I'll throw your slides for you. When the program was set up back in 2016 for implementation during FY 2017, we were set up as the administrator of the grant, and that is because the program is available to all eligible training providers, and that includes the community colleges, the higher education centers in Virginia, and Richard Bland Community College. Currently, only the community colleges and the Southern Virginia Higher Education Center participate, but we do the administration of the grant. So just to give you a little background on the program and the amount, the amount of funds that were provided. So in FY17, the original amount for the grant was $4 million, and last session that was switched to have the $5 million for FY17 and $7.5 million for FY18. As I mentioned, the eligible institutions for that are limited to the community colleges and the higher ed centers, and it's for non-credit instruction, so there's some questions about credit versus non-credit. And as Dr. Herndon said, that is, the credit model is funded through the regular allocations for the institutions, but this is really the first time that the state really took action to fund non-credit and to do something called a paid for performance program. To explain a little bit more about how that works, with the pay for performance, this slide at the bottom here talks about where it's a shared cost. So the student pays 1/3 of the cost at the beginning of the program, and if they complete the training, that's all the obligation that they have. So if they complete the training, the state pays the institution 1/3 of the cost, and then if they complete the credential, they pay the remaining 1/3. It's a little bit of a two-step process. When we're working with industry-based certifications, you complete your credential, you complete your training, and then you need to go get your certification either through some third-party based group. So after the completion of the training, the institutions reimburse that 1/3, and then they only get paid if the student gets that credential. So sometimes if a student doesn't complete, then it's on the institution to really have an incentive to go back and get those students to complete the credential. The maximum reimbursement, yes?
3,000 include the student
No, so it's a maximum up to the 3,000, so that's that 2/3 piece, so they can be up to about 4,500. And it could be a higher cost program, the student still pays the full 1/3, but the state only maximum does the reimbursement for 3,000. I'm sorry, I think I'm working now. I apologize. For the grant purpose, just to reiterate a few things, that it really was driven to, and this is outlined in the Virginia and as part of the enacting legislation, that was to create and sustain demand-driven supply of credentialed workers in high-demand occupations, really looking at skills gap and addressing a skills gap. Also expanding affordability. With this 1/3 model, this really lowered the cost of training that was offered through non-credit to students and made it a little bit more accessible, particularly for those that couldn't afford it. And then another element of the grant was to increase interest into specific jobs. Some emphasis on technician, technologist, and trade level, and jobs that require less than a bachelor's degree but no more than a high school diploma. Sarah's talked a little bit about how the high demand's been identified. It did start with the board identifying those jobs, and then institutions are required to go back and approve training programs that align with those. So it's at their discretion to find out what programs align with those high demand occupations and design those programs for that. There is the ability to petition, as Sarah mentioned, in terms of if there's a high demand occupation that wasn't on the list and they see that there's been a demand in the area for the program, then they can petition to have that added. Just to go over a few things in the high demand fields that Sarah identified. This was back in for fiscal year 2017. Based on what the board had done, they had identified 57,000 jobs with high demand in the high demand area that was meeting that criteria that Sarah explained. And as was already discussed, and I'll show you in a table later on, there were some programs that did not find a fit in terms of training, and so sometimes training wasn't offered in those areas, as we talked about with the engineers. But originally that was the number of job openings in those high demand occupations, and this is by those occupational fields that you see here. When we talk about training, just to give you some ideas of what we're referring to, there's some examples here of what types of certification students are seeking in terms of computer mathematical, examples of CompTIA, networking, Cisco networking, healthcare practitioners, certified nurses, AAs, medical assistants, pharmacy technicians, and in transportation, commercial driver's license. We have a whole host of what the training is involved in. It may have been included in your packet as well. We are compiling the data for FY17. It does take a little bit of time for a student to enroll and then complete the training, and then we do allow up to 180 days for the student to get that certification. Sometimes they need to get a testing site, they need to work on a little more studying before they go to get to that certification. So we're looking at what the FY17 data, so all students that finished classes by June 30th of 2017. So the data that you see here, which is categorized by occupational field, we are doing some, this is some preliminary data that's being verified by community colleges, and we expect to have that final later this week. But just to give you a general idea by those occupational fields, we have the number that have enrolled in the program, those that have completed the training, and then the number that have reported a credential attained. I have a little asterisk there on that last table. One thing I want to note is we need the students to come back and report the credentials. Dr. Herndon can talk a little bit about doing that, because sometimes when you see a lower attainment rate, it could be a variety of factors. It can be a factor that the student has not come back and gotten the straight and reported that. They can do some matches and find other ways to get it, but it could be that, or it could be that the student actually took the test and didn't get it. So I just want to provide that caveat there in terms of why we use the word credential, reported or credential attained.
It's the same number we used for the one last month's reimbursement. Students, that's that number is used, they don't report the funds.
They don't go back to the college, so there is an incentive for the college to get those data and to get that information. Yes. Just some other general program data in terms of the types of demographics and the students that are being served. 61% are male. We've had some of our higher areas that were being filled in manufacturing technician, in computer, as well as commercial driver's license, heavier in males going into those occupations. The type of student that's being served is an average age of about 35, 36, so an older adult. There's been a lot of interest in wages and what we have there. Again, trying to get those, at this point, the program is so new, we have a small number of students at this point, but I'm working with community colleges in our own analysis, looking at the pre-training annual median wages. Those are looking at about $22,000 for the median wages for those. Of course, it varies by the occupational field that they're in, but that was what the median wages were looking like. Average program tuition cost, that's the full cost to the student, about $2,600. But with that reduced cost, so if they complete the program, complete that training, they're only having to pay about $879. The percentage that are completing training average is about 93 completing the training, and about 66% that are completing the credential, reporting that credential. So, excuse me, use my wording of reporting a credential attained. And we had some conversation with Dr. Herndon. I'm sure you can answer a little bit more. In looking at some of those data, we think that's probably the lowest amount. They've done a lot of modifications on how they'll be looking to try to get more students to report and to work on that. So 66% is probably what we'll see as the bottom number, and then we'll continue to see that number grow in the first year. This was the first year of implementation with the program. It's continuing to move forward into year 2. There has been a high demand, so the amount originally allocated for this year is $7.5 million. Those funds have been obligated for this year, so the program is currently paused as a result of that. So we'll hear from Tracy, and actually probably circle back and talk about how we're working on how to look forward to, how to look at how we manage that moving forward based on some of the JLARD findings. So I'll stop there.
Mr. Chair, Wendy mentioned that they did not get reimbursed, community college did not get reimbursed if they didn't get certification. The other part of that is the completion. If they don't complete it, they don't. So that gives a strong motivation for community colleges to work with students to get them to stay in the class.
Other questions to Frank's basketball program? In our community, I think this is one of the most important consequential programs we've passed in the last 10 years. It's going to really affect people's lives in a way. We're reporting size a little bit, but there's a little bit of concern, right? And that there's a financial way to incentivize the student that they hold back or something like that. But is there a way to do that? It's so good that you hate to have a lack of credentials that are being reported back that will show that you're successful. Yes,
Sorry, I didn't. Under the healthcare support, does that include home care assistance? And is there any credential
Certified nursing assistants were on the demand occupation list. Home health aides, I believe, are on the list as well. From the board's perspective, they are an identified demand occupation.
is there any credential?
Yes, our colleges, varies by college, they define it as the regional demand occupation. But you'll find a number of colleges prepare students for CNA, another number of other colleges also prepare students for medication, which can complement program therapies.
One of my concerns is they're so poorly compensated that they somehow, we could increase the respect and the credential that goes with this population, maybe better make the case that we're gonna need a lot more of that.
Senator Calvin, may I respond to a little bit of data we know about those folks? Wendy points to average annual salary of $22,000, which she mentions too, there's so much variation in by program. Our early analysis of data tells us that those who are pursuing CNA, their pre-training wage for the year prior is $8,000.
good for that certified person, but it doesn't address the need that we have for many more.
Thank you very much. So next is Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tracy Smith. I'm one of JLARC's 3 associate directors, and I had the privilege this past year of overseeing the JLARC study team that conducted our broader review of the entire Virginia Community College system. I should caveat by saying that I am neither a labor market economist nor an expert in higher education programs, and so our team worked very closely with the folks here next to me throughout the course of the study. They were extremely helpful and cooperative, and we really appreciate their continued cooperation as we continue to look at the improvements that are being made to the program. So we really appreciate the opportunity to share our good work with the committee. Through House Joint Resolution 157 that was passed during the 2016 legislative session, the General Assembly directed us to review the Virginia Community College system. And that was really intended to be sort of a top-to-bottom review of the entire system. It mostly focused on student progression through the system's academic programs. We also looked at the affordability of those programs. We examined how well the system's dual enrollment program and the transfer programs were working. We also examined the system office role and how well it was supporting the 23 colleges within the system. And finally, we looked at how the individual colleges were spending their general and non-general funds. We did conduct a high-level review of the system's workforce development programs. We felt like a deep dive into workforce development and how it's done by VCCS really wasn't necessary for this 2017 study because we had conducted a very extensive study in 2014 of the state's broader workforce development programs and how they're working together as a system or how they're not. Much of our fieldwork and analysis for this VCCS study was really designed to gauge how the delivery of workforce programs had changed, if at all, by VCCS since our 2014 study. And I should say that during that 2014 study, we really found that VCCS was really one of the top performers in terms of providing workforce development services to employers, working well with employers and being responsive to their needs. I can't say the same for some other providers of workforce development services, and so that 2014 report concluded that VCCS really was doing a very good job at matching their programs with what employers needed. So for the 2017 VCCS study, we also did take a look at the implementation of the Workforce Credentials Grant Program. That was a little bit tricky for us because it was a brand new program when we started looking at it. That, sometimes you have to really approach something like that with caution because any new program is going to have kinks that need to be worked out. And certainly that's the case with this one as well. We did in our review conclude that there are some improvements that can be made to the program to ensure that the limited funding that is available for it is used most efficiently and effectively. On this slide, there are a lot of words on this slide. It's my attempt to boil down our key findings for you all. Overall, in the study, we found that according to labor market data, all colleges offer programs in career fields with the greatest statewide demand. However, we did find a limited number of high-demand career fields for which local colleges do not or are unable to offer courses. When we looked at the WCG program, of course, we found that it was created in part to address worker shortages for high-demand occupations. The program has funded a wide variety of VCCS courses and workforce credentials, but we determined that the criteria for receiving funds were really too broad to prioritize programs that would first address workforce shortages. Mr. Chairman, I'll just go over this slide briefly. There's a portion of our report that really talks about how well the individual colleges' programs align regionally with what we are seeing in labor market data in terms of what's in demand from employers in terms of job openings. We found that generally it's well aligned, but just as in 2014, in 2017, meeting employer demands remains a challenge for some colleges. And what we heard from staff at the community college level was that they were having trouble offering courses in fields such as finance, maintenance, repair and installation, healthcare, pipe fitting and welding, and several other examples that are included in our final report. So on to the WCG program. As the folks ahead of me have said, this program was created in part to help colleges offer programs to meet employers' needs. Linking that back to the last slide where we're finding colleges having trouble to offer certain programs, WCG program is in part intended to address those limitations. It's supposed to do that by incentivizing students to enroll in community college courses that would prepare them to go into occupations that are in high demand, which is a specific term that's used in the legislation that establishes the program. And that legislation defines high demand occupations specifically as those for which there are not enough workers to fill existing or projected demand from employers. So we're talking about fields for which there are worker shortages. Labor market data as well as direct input from the state's employers can be used to identify occupations for which there are worker shortages. I think it's important to understand that all community colleges offered non-credit, workforce-oriented coursework that could lead to an industry recognized credential of some sort even before the WCG program came online. In those cases, courses were fully paid for by the students themselves, or in many cases by their employers who wanted them to receive additional training. What the WCG has done is to provide financial aid to students to make those programs more affordable and potentially more attractive. As you know, $12.5 million was appropriated for the first 2 years of the program, and I do believe that additional funding was needed within the first year because the funds were committed so quickly. Mr. Chairman, before I move to the next slide, I'd like to emphasize that JLARC did confirm that the funds were spent to lower the cost of taking courses and earning credentials for occupations that are in demand by employers. And so, for example, funds were spent on students for welding programs, pharmacy tech programs. There are labor market data indicating that there are job openings in those types of programs. So these funds are being spent on programs for which employers are hiring. What was not as clear to us is the extent to which the funds were prioritized first and foremost for courses and credentials related to occupations for which there were worker shortages. We primarily focused on the process that the Board of Workforce Development and BCCS used to determine which courses at which colleges should receive the WCG funds. And when we spoke with program staff about the process and reviewed program documents, it appeared to us that the criteria that were used to determine the program's eligibility did not include whether or not there was a worker shortage for the particular occupation. So for example, the Board of Workforce Development, as Sarah has discussed, was charged with creating a list of high demand occupations. And that list is used to determine which BCCS courses could be eligible for WCG program funds. The board did consider several important and very key metrics in developing its high demand occupations list, but evidence of worker shortage did not appear to us to be one of them. Moreover, BCCS is charged with determining which specific college programs should receive WCG funds. At the time of our review, and again, we briefed JLARC in September, so I'm sure there have been changes since then, the data and information that colleges were required to submit to the system office to qualify their programs for WCG funds were insufficient to really allow BCCS to determine whether WCG funds would help colleges address the unmet workforce needs of their employers in the college's regions. Community college system staff told us that as long as there was evidence that there was an employer demand for a credential, the course or program that leads to that credential could qualify for the funds. Given the limited nature of the funding, we felt that although that scenario certainly has merit, it was not entirely consistent with the purpose of the program. And so we had a couple of recommendations in the report. First, to ensure that funds are prioritized for courses or programs in fields for which there are worker shortages, we recommended that an order of priority be established for the funds. And this could be done through the budget, it could be done through amending the code that established the program. We also recommended, and this is a little bit technical, we recommended that the Board of Workforce Development really take the lead in developing a methodology that could be used by the individual colleges as well as the state to distinguish between demand that is sufficiently met by the existing workforce in a particular region and demand that isn't. So the full report is online. Again, we looked at a whole lot more than workforce in this study. I'm happy to make hard copies available to folks who are interested. It's always a pleasure to share our good work with you all. It's a privilege to be involved in this study.
very good question. So, evidence of employer demand would be there are job openings for this particular occupation. Evidence of unmet demand would be there are job openings, but we don't have enough folks exiting programs or obtaining those credentials to fill those job openings. So there's a worker shortage and unmet demand.
We do have a, correct me, I'm asking really, do we have a statewide jobs board? Yeah.
So the Virginia Employment Commission operates the state's labor exchange system. That's the Virginia Workforce Connection. And subsequent to the JLAC report, we have taken a look at some data, and specifically around what are the different ways that we could determine supply. And I think Tracy's pointed to one, which is actually looking at program completers in each of these occupational clusters and testing that against either the projections data, which we use, or active job openings, which is another measure of that. So the Virginia Workforce Connection is the state's labor exchange system. It is a repository for candidate data for those folks that have registered to use that site, which would include, of course, all of our UI claimants, all of our VIEW program participants, most of the individuals who had received services at one of our one-stop career centers, for example, and just general members of the public. The jobs in that site are either cultivated, if you will, by the Virginia Employment Commission, but that website also uses some spidering technology, so it pulls in job information from other boards. So it's fairly robust in terms of its representation of the actual job openings in the Commonwealth.
Mr. Chairman, I think that one of the challenges is that the next evolution in education is connecting certification, degree, whatever it is, to employment. And we just have to see if we can make those data connections, and that's my question. Do we have the right repository for jobs to compare our credential preparedness? We get into the schools and see who's in what program, but you know, I'm just curious about how we collect the data points.
This feels somewhat static, and I'm wondering if there's the capability to predict which jobs that may be unmet now, but won't be needed in the next 5 to 10 years.
Would you like me to address
Yeah.
There are some states, for example, North Carolina has developed what they call the disruption index, which is a predictive model that shows which jobs would be most vulnerable to things like automation or artificial intelligence, for example. Personally, I'm really intrigued by Virginia developing capabilities in that area because it'll help us get out of the now, right? And ensure that we're making investments that are gonna have some long-term return. That being said, I think we're in a much different labor market. I think the creation and destruction of jobs, meaning occupations, is just happening at a pace that's in some ways unprecedented. And the ways that we're applying education, the Workforce Credential Grant Program is a perfect example, is different than we've done before. I mean, these are industry recognized, validated demonstrations of competency. Credentials are really boxes of skills with a label on the front. And they are labels that are recognized by companies, public and private sector employers, that show them that the people have the know-how that credential represents. So we have not taken that step. The long-term projections that are developed by the Bureau, by the Virginia Employment Commission, they use a fairly sophisticated forecasting model, which is supported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's used by all 50 states. And so it does include a little bit of that kind of forward look. Now, forecasts are always based on the past. So when we get kind of these really abrupt disruptions, our models are not going to be able to predict that as reliably. But I think that's a really good point.
Mr. Chairman, I was just thinking about pharmacist assistants, for example. There's a big need for those,
little bit of this conversation at another point, and I think we need to look at both the current and the long term, because some of this training is, it's a short-term training, a pharmacy technician, what is it? A few weeks, yeah, and so it's really able to put somebody out to fill that unmet demand right there. And the same thing came up with the commercial driver's license. I mean, we have a whole port, we're looking to get the products moved out of the port. We need truckers, and we need people to do that. And because these are these short terms, they're really intended to help people get out into a job quickly, and particularly in the technician, the technician area that was focused on, and the technologist trade level positions. Over the life, even in IT, you used to get a certification in COBOL or something, and now you move out to others. So the training certifications will keep coming back, and you will need to keep adjusting. We expect that community colleges will align that training, but some of those certifications will be needed now. And if we held off to look at the long-term ones, we have employers that will still say, I still don't have the pharmacy assistants, or the truckers that we need to fill that. So it's probably a little bit of a balance of both, and it does look at the whole broad spectrum of building a pipeline, which may also be, moving into the college area, associate degrees and bachelor's degrees, to think of the future and what will be automated moving forward.
You struck home with COBOL. When you're old enough to learn. When the time comes up.
That's some kind of memo?
Separate, given this, sorry, before you report, my next connection is with Subcommittee, because as you know, they by far and away the more credentials right there doing it. Did yours review break it down by colleges? In other words, are there guys that are doing best practices and guys that are helping you? Maybe that's a conversation we can have. Is there good data broken down by community colleges?
Senator, that's a great question, and actually it might be more pertinent for our 2014 study, where we looked more broadly at workforce development, and we looked at BCCS's non-credit programs in general before the WCG to see how well aligned they were with the region's employers' needs, how well the leaders at the community colleges were incorporating employer input into their decisions about which programs to offer and which ones to discontinue. There certainly are some that are better than others. I'd be happy to go back through the information we collected in 2014 and provide you with some additional information. The bottom line being, in general, we found that BCCS, in terms of making those decisions, was doing a great job, and that was coming from the employers. That's what the employers told us. I think with respect to the WCG, what we're seeing is there is the potential for these limited funds to be spent on programs that students would have already enrolled in, because they would have already paid for it themselves, or their employer would have. And so the question is whether this funding is being targeted to stimulate new interest that wasn't there before, or new ability to attend the programs that wasn't there before, or whether it's being used to fund credentials that would have been attained anyway through other means.
Follow up on that. The average age is 35 years old. That generally is somebody who has a dependent or two. And the purpose of this was to get those into the workforce. Yes, you may have 18-year-olds being completely happy living at home, getting free food, stretching out welding for 2 years. But for somebody with a dependent, they would be paying for they finished the 2-year program. So that was exceedingly important that we get that money to them so that they would have a reason to finish the program and get a job.
Senator, my understanding was that BCCS did look at the number of program participants that they did have indicators of being low income or needing financial assistance, and there were indications that certainly the program was reaching individuals that may not have otherwise been able to afford the cost of the program. I agree.
Mr. Chairman, one of the challenges of the community colleges were the fact that they could get Pell Grants 2 years certainly helped their bottom line more than this program does.
Any further questions?
Thank you, appreciate that. Well, I should utilize some very things in this presentation, but I think those panelists will cover much of what I intended to, so I'll move quickly. Very brief description of the problem. Probably no surprise to you that half of all jobs in Virginia require more of a high school diploma less than a college degree. And yet Virginia's workforce is established situated only 4 in 10 have those credentials. And so there's a gap, and that gap results in tens of thousands of jobs being vacant in Virginia on an annual basis. And increasingly, businesses identify that these short-term certifications of skill, the package of competencies and knowledge, are the pathway that leads them most efficiently to those jobs. And so, I won't recover that what Chev's role is, what the board's role is, and what community college role is, except to say this is not an accounting program. This program is business-led. It's an indication of what credentials matter at a regional level. And the bullet that I've omitted here is one to say that it's been transformative to community colleges. Senator Ruff pointed out that there was a time when resources were and students were driven towards longer-term programs because that's where the funding was. There was an FTE offset to the state. There were Pell Grants. There is federal financial aid beyond Pell Grants that support students through longer-term instruction. It rewards time and seat versus competency and knowledge. This program transforms that. It rewards completion. It rewards credential. It rewards alignment to business needs. And so I commend the body and your patriots for passing this couple of years ago and funding it. I want to preface this slide by saying these are just those credentials that are funded to the Workforce Credentials Grant. So Senator Newman, yes, Central Virginia Community College actually leads the state number of credentials in total. These are those that are offset with this high demand resource. And you'll see that these resources are distributed quite well throughout the state. We expected, if you base it on population alone, you'd see a lot more credentials in Virginia and in Richmond and Hampton Roads. And yet 40% of the credentials issued to date are in rural Virginia, where just 25% of the population resides. That's a good indication of where the skills are in those demand. There's a greater demand for shorter term workforce training in Southwest, Southside, or you might find in Northern Virginia. The demand exists there, as you can see in this chart, but the demand is even stronger in rural Virginia. In total, demand exceeds the supply. Resources are being outstripped by the demand for business for these credentials. 4,595 credentials have been issued to date. We have limited data on job placement, but the limited data we do have tells us that we're seeing rates of placement of 90% or better in many fields. And to go back, I want to harken back to the JLOC study. Tracy and I were talking beforehand, and she said the disadvantage of that, any order we go in would be that, well, the disadvantages, we want to be that Tracy speaking from what happened when JLOC issued its study September 11, 2017, and what Virginia's learned since then. One of the things we didn't have access to at the time was some comparison for the credentials we've issued since this program began and those that were issued before the program began. And so we didn't know when JLOC studied this program, are we actually creating more credentials? And so I can tell you definitively now there are 3,400 more credentials being issued on a yearly basis than there were before the existence of this program. So yes, there are Virginians, I suspect there in any given class in Virginia right now, there might be a student there who would have paid the full rate had he or she not had access to the Workforce Credentials Grant. But there are 3,400 more students with credentials specifically in this program who history tells us would not, that's good for Virginia. We also know from an early analysis of data, let me explain this one as best I can. We have access to the wage records of the students we serve in this program. About 7,000 folks in total. We know what they made according to VEC's records in the year leading up to training. The average wage is what we identified in the presentation, less than $22,000 a year. The average student. In some programs in Northern Virginia, the average student is making $60,000 a year before he met them. He or she is aspiring for that high-need, highly paid cybersecurity credential. They aspire for a $75,000 a year job. In other parts of the Commonwealth, they're aspiring for a $22,000 a year job. On average, the wage before we met them was $22,000 a year. We then matched those wages up by program to the known Virginia salary at the 25th percentile of each region. So we can forecast with some reasonability and say, all right, if you earn this credential, what would you expect to make in the field you intend to enter? The forecast that will result in a 50% wage increase by credential on average. That sounds ambitious, right? And I was even hesitant to put in the presentation. I had good news though, through Senator Ruff's constant encouragement We have done some analysis, and we expect the full results of that analysis middle of next week, but we analyzed a couple of programs. We analyzed manufacturing and welding. In manufacturing, we served 120 students leading up to April 1 of 2017. So between the start of this program, that was in June 30th or July 1, 2016, to April 1, 2017, we served 120 students who earned a manufacturing credential. We served more than that, they just had their credentials haven't been completed yet. Of those 120 students, the salary before we met them, 120, the average salary was $37,000 a year, which is actually a little higher than I would have thought. Their average salary, 6 months after, looking actually, it's not 6 months after, we received the data afterwards, but looking back to 6 months upon completion, their average salary rose to $50,000 a year. So we took folks from 120 of them, on average from $37,000 a year to $50,000 a year. That seems like good news. The same analysis was conducted on welding. The welding students were more like the average. Their salary before we met them was $19,800. Flash forward, after training, the 6 months that follows training, so leave training in the 6 months that then follows the quarters that DEC provides to us, their average salary went from $19,000 a year to $30,000 a year. That's a 50% gain, just as we forecasted. I will not guarantee that our rest of our forecast will be that accurate, but as the center says, it's a good start. And so we intend to analyze our programs by program. This is a very early look. For many programs, we won't have sufficient number of students who've completed training and 6 months have passed and they show DEC records to have conclusive evidence of each credential we offer. But our early analysis of 2 programs, just for the sake of coming today to show something, so Senator Ruck knows that we're doing our very best to analyze these data, we see encouraging progress.
Mr. Jerry, what was the first program?
The first program is manufacturing. My apologies. Manufacturing for the first, that was $37,000 to $50,000, and then welding was $19,000 to $30,000. And by the way, the in for welding was 80 students, so it's not a huge data set, but I feel comfortable enough saying with 80 people, we got a good feel for the average.
We've got the job placement at 90% in some fields. Give me an example of fields where you're getting 90% placement.
Yes, truck driving is a very good example of that. CDL is a very strong placement for programs. Some of our programs are already near 100% placement for CDL programs. The other program that I think of very frequently is Power Line Worker Training Program that operates out of South Subcommittee Community College. There's a comparable program with Bill Community College, their sister programs. Withville is currently touting 100% placement rate. They've only had 2 cohorts, but still 100% placement rate. Southside has multiple cohorts, and they're hovering north of 90% for their placement. I can't promise we'll see those consistently, but I'll do my best.
Where are you finding, what fields are you finding the most challenging or weakest?
The fields for which we're most challenged, I would actually go back to Wendy's analysis of credential attainment. And that's, the challenge starts there. There are 3 things that probably Wendy mentioned a 66% credential attainment and recording rate. So of that remaining 34%, there are some students out there who've earned a credential who just haven't told us because there's no financial incentive for them to tell us that. It's on the community college data. They don't tell us, we do our best, we track them down, but there's some students who just can't get evidence. Problem 2 is there are programs for which it's hard to test, but there is a long line in inavailability of testing when you're in Southwest Virginia. The demand for the credentials there, but the availability of testing in Southwest Virginia is sparse. And so every student we send down to test passes, or nearly every student does, but the availability of testing is limited. Problem 2. And problem 3, in full transparency, our community college workforce programs have not had this high degree of accountability previously. And we're looking for and identifying places where we improve curriculum. An example of improving curriculum is at Northern Virginia Community College. The students we serve before the introduction come in and shell out $4,500 for a high-end cybersecurity credential. They were employed in field and they had $4,500 in cash. The students we're serving at Northern Virginia Community College right now, we're seeing lower income students show up. They aspire for those $60,000 a year jobs. They have far less experience in cybersecurity. And therefore, Northern Virginia Community College has deliberately altered its training to meet the needs of folks who didn't come in at point C on their way to point F. They're coming in at point A. And so NOVA went from a low credential attainment rate in cybersecurity to I think, a respectful credential thing. I mean, we had discussed this before. She said, what do you think of this, Craig? He showed me a really low number. I said, and then I went back to the college and they showed me how that rate is actually now above the average.
Yes, Mr. Point is cybersecurity, we're in the areas where you have a more challenging placement.
Placement, no. Credential attainment rate, yes. Placement to be determined. The wage outcome data will be our best indicator of that. So I have yet to hear the negative story about placement. I'm all too familiar with the things we are doing to increase the credential attainment rate.
We often focus on our successes, but sometimes it helps to look at where we're fragile to know where we can improve.
I look forward to the wage data helping us to identify where those exist.
But you don't even have any anecdotal observations where that might be.
No, sir, no.
I could put my lawyer hat on. Senator Hager.
Mr. Craig, you indicated, weakness in accountability previously, and are y'all working on a tracking system for these people to get out so that you have, so that they can come back to us with good data in another year?
Yes, we're pleased. I mean, VEC's resources here are very helpful, so it doesn't require us to go and track down each person and ask them what they're making right now. We're doing a few things. Where someone earns a credential issued by the state, we're working on data sharing agreements. So a CDL should be really easy to get our hands on. Virginia issues that. Some of the healthcare occupations, even though Virginia issues those credentials, we're breaking down walls now to gain access to the healthcare credentials, even though they're issued by Virginia. We've made some good progress there. There are other licenses and certifications issued by the Commonwealth for which we intend to automate, so the student doesn't need to tell us. We can just go right to the data source and match them. Regrettably, there are 7,000 different credential issuers in the nation, and so we will not form relationships with all 7,000 to share their data. We're going after the biggest fish first. We intend to ask for data sharing agreements with folks like the American Bowling Society. They're a big recipient of our students, and they were an incentive to want to share their data with us. So I foresee a future where we will have more automated processing of those going to the students who are asking. We can gain much of the data directly from the credential issuer.
Sure, at one time, I was a proprietary business college. We were required to track that data so we could lose our accreditation. We were eligible for Pell Grants, all of that. That's part of it. I think that may be an area that we're weak in as far as state managed programs at all levels, not just community colleges.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just briefly point to a couple of examples. Folks who earn power line credentials, like Maeve, who works for one of the electrical co-ops in Southern Virginia. Corey, who has earned multiple credentials, is now moved from multiple jobs to one single job to support her family in Central Virginia. Micah, who now works for Newport News Shipyard after a period of just weeks of training, getting access to a high-paying job on the shipyard. And finally, point to a number of businesses who are supporting her, including Micah, Northern Virginia, and others. And a few quotes from them. I'll spare you the reading of them, but they're there to your enjoyment. And simply point to the fact that this program is performing exactly as the legislation intended. Businesses leading the identification of need. Colleges are addressing business demand and helping students gain credentials. Virginians are earning high-demand credentials that move into better paying jobs. And the state is only paying for results as opposed to seat time, enrollments, or something else. And so I wouldn't be doing my job as a member of Virginia Community Colleges if I didn't point to legislative proposals that exist out there, the funding proposals, the requests.
Other than funding, what can we do to assist people?
Other than funding, that's a great question. What's that?
So all you want is money.
Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. You said testing.
Well, he's not off the hook yet.
I tried to
A
help.
little time, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You said testing in Southwest was one of your biggest obstacles. Solutions for that? Or maybe I don't understand the process.
I guess I tend to simplify things perhaps unnecessarily. Two forms of testing dominate these credentials. One would be testing through a state organization, getting with that DMV staff member who has to travel in a circuit, and she person tested in Martinsville, in Bath County, and I believe in far southwest. And there's one of her, and she travels the circuit and can make it sometimes to Martinsville as infrequently as once every 3 or 4 weeks, depending on her availability. And so getting time with her is fantastic, but she's just one person. Another challenge, that's the state side of things. Many of these tests require I'm going to mess with the terminology, a biometric facility that validates the user. And those are expensive operations. In many metropolitan areas like Northern Virginia, they exist on every 3rd corner. You could stop in for your GRE or MCAT or wherever else. In far southwest Virginia, those facilities are few and far between. And so students might have to shuttle to West Virginia. We've actually incentivized our colleges to actually, when I got our first request in the system office for funds to drive a van to Withville, I said, why more would we pay for a van ride to Withville? And the answer was, because we can get 8 students together and test all at one time. I said, let's get a van, let's get them to Withville. And so the availability of testing centers and the availability of testing staff are the primary challenges in Southwest Virginia, which are solvable by funding, Mr. Chairman. I would mention, but I'll continue thinking.
Mr. Chairman, since it's a panel, I thought it might be okay if I jumped in. 2 points to make. I think first on the wage data, my expectation is that there is a lot of literature out there and other studies that would show similar findings, that someone who goes through a training program or education and earns a credential is likely to improve their wages over and above what they were making before they went through the program. And so I think there's a general expectation for what the wage analysis will find. We do have an economist on staff, and he did look at student level data, not for the WCG program because we don't have those data, they're too recent. Looked at individuals who had gone through non-credit programs at BCCS and earned a credential, and did find, in fact, that there was a positive impact on their wages. And so I think it's likely that Chev and BCCS will find the same thing with respect to the WCG. I think it's really important in looking at that, and I don't know if the data are there to do it, is really to determine for those individuals which ones would not have been able to enroll in those programs without the WCG, and look at the impact on their wages rather than look at impact on wages as a whole, because really that is in part what the program is intended to do, is to allow folks who otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford these programs to afford them. I think in listening to Craig talk, I'm reminded at how much there is an emphasis on the WCG, the intent of it to make these programs more affordable for folks who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. And certainly that is one of the purposes stated in the goal in the code. It's extremely laudable. However, our feeling is that there are limited dollars for this program, and in order to really make the greatest impact on the state, on economic, to the greatest economic impact, the greatest impact on employers, there really should be an order of priority established so that you're focusing on occupations for which there are worker shortages, and that not necessarily be overtaken by the desire to provide financial assistance for non-credit programs.
Mr. Chairman, one point that I want to make.
Sure, make that one.
The private sector has jumped on this. At the Greenville campus, since community college, the national construction company building the Dominion power plant in Greenville gave the equipment to train. And that was, you have any idea how much that paid?
I believe their total contribution is over $500,000. I think it's coming up towards $1 million.
So as we've had the conversation about money, I encourage community colleges to reach out to the private partners to try to get more resources. One other point that I think that first round, one community college was believed that they could jack up the price. Have you taken care of that problem?
Yes, sir. The chancellor, upon the passing of this legislation, there was no state funding for these programs. So they're really driven by what the local community, the costs and local communities market. And so the chancellor instituted and we have fully implemented prices for these programs that are consistent across community colleges based on the cost of the program as opposed to the market itself.
Thank you.
introduce the appropriation laws?
Might want to talk to Valley.
Well, I expect the Valley might have one perspective, Lincoln Rose might have another.
Mr. Chairman, one thing I didn't mention is Chev does have a role to do some periodic evaluations. So you had JLERC, and having been a former JLERCer, I would value them coming back because they're such great resources and folks to use. But part of our role is to do the evaluation. We did start to look at it. You've heard periodically throughout the conversation that Craig and I have had conversations about some things. This was a first-year implementation, so I've shared kind of what the general aspects of the program are, but there are a lot of conversations that we're having. Between that is we're there to have that second eye and to look at some of those things like the low completion rates in terms of making sure it's the unmet demand. And that's been something that's been discussed to bring to the Virginia board, which was a recommendation for from JLAR to move forward to do and to think about prioritization in terms of that, depending on whatever funding level is determined by the General Assembly. Our role as Chev as an administrator is to try to make sure that those recommendations are looked at, to continue to looking at different aspects of the program as more data become available and be able to serve as a resource to you as well and being able to provide that view. So feel free to contact us at any time if you have any other questions on that.
To that, the model of 130, 130, so if you would, right, because it requires the institution to get an outcome, right, which is some of the rules approach. And I agree with what the stated purpose and code is, but it seems to be that there are areas where we are sending people through, through math and through some biology and other things, but honestly, we don't need to send them. So there may be places where we want to do the exact opposite of what you stated. We may want to say, some areas, we need to convert them into credentials and move them away from a tradition, because we may have said that in the code, but what we really want is them to move from not having a job or not having a job or having a job, no matter what the language said. So it seems to me that a review of some of those items that currently are associates that could be done in credential might also be a productive request.
A general question, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, Senator.
With this panel, this panel might know the answer to this. We used to have a governor that every couple of days he'd make a statement, we've got 36,000 job openings right now.
Sometimes it's changed with that.
The wages that will pay 80-some thousand. Have y'all identified, did any of y'all work on identifying where these jobs are at? Sarah?
Yes, this keeps me up at night quite often. I do track the number of active job openings, okay, the number of active job postings, and typically when we're doing real-time labor market analytics, what we do is we take a look at all the jobs on the web, we deduplicate them, we parse them, we drop them into industry and occupation. So we do have some data, point in time data regarding active job postings. Now, my caution there will be, there are some industries which use the internet quite often to post jobs, right? Pretty much 99% of all IT jobs in Virginia are posted on the web. The trick for us is to deduplicate them because the recruiters do some very clever things to try to increase the pool of interested candidates. Other industries like manufacturing, for example, aren't as active by using online job posting as a mechanism to recruit. We see disparities between more of our urban areas and more of our rural areas. And so that's that's one of the cautions. But I do think online job posting activity is an indicator of recruiting intensity. When we see increases, it means that there is more recruiting activity, which can indicate there's a scarcity or shortage. So do you want me to give you the number?
You got it?
I do.
So this is more than pays more than 86,000.
No, this is the well, I can give you two numbers. I can give you the number of active online job postings and some wage data. So last time I checked, which was probably about a week ago, there were about 150,000 active job postings, which we could identify, deduplicate, and slot and direct to an employer. statewide. The wages, really the only data that I would rely on is wages that are signaled in the posting themselves, and that's a really relatively small percentage of all the job postings include a wage. So I would be hesitant to even name one. But we do know the average wages for any occupation, so if we use that as a proxy. Of those 150,000, about 33 to 36,000 are usually in that computer IT segment. And the average wages last time I checked for jobs in that category were about $89,000 a year.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the point I would make with that is, it seems that if there is an identifiable population out there of those number of job openings, we'd be much better served to follow the path of locating those jobs, identifying, finding individuals, trading for them, rather than spending their money forwarding the Amazons of the world. I guess that's where I would go with that. We could try to take a change behind doing that and be further ahead.
Since it's also like I was saying, that income of 50,000 people in one area. I think they take care of somewhere in that where they call it.
Well, what I'm saying is, we got 50,000 jobs right now, we just have people running for them.
Any other questions?
Can I just follow up on those comments where if you don't mind? But I think it's important to know you're never gonna get to inbox zero with jobs. There are always gonna be employers recruiting because there is a churn. So I wanna caution us that, let's not aspire to get that 150 number down to zero, because that's not gonna happen. Because there is a fair amount of churn. I think we know what that is by industry. So there is a natural rate, I think, at which we're always gonna have job postings at that time.
Back to zero, there will be a lot of folks who would leave to.
So I just, while we're talking about this, because, we're kind of designing how we're gonna approach this in the future, and I think Workforce Credentials does something that we don't do with the other higher ed programs, and it references what Senator Newman said. If we're gonna talk about maybe credentials that would replace an associate's degree, for instance, that's really dictated by the employer. And so it's not just us having a conversation about what transitions we can make. We need to take this to the employer base. But the same thing's true for these IT jobs. What does it take to meet the needs of a company that wants to employ somebody in the IT world? Is it a complete degree in computer science? Or could Virginia maybe come up with a core competency or a minor or something where every Virginia graduate, even if they had a psychology degree, had that minimum requirement so they'd be employable in the IT community? That's the workforce of the future. There is no job you can't do with IT minimum competencies. And if we could change, we could incentivize our baccalaureate and universities, or those programs, to train every graduate. You can still choose to do psychology. I think that's our number one MBA degree, psychology, which is not very employable. They can still choose psychology, but they would, if they want to get it with the IT minor and they're employable, they get more money from the state than if they choose to get it without.
Any other comments or questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not responding to your question.
I'm looking forward to that phone call.
Two-part response right now, very briefly, and that is, it's early enough in this program that I wouldn't advise it today. What we are seeing, there may be some needs in help with data sharing agreements between state agencies to receive data on credential taking. I think it's probably something we continue to work out internally, but legislation may be useful in the future to help with data sharing across education and providers of licenses and certifications. And the second, this is still early in our thinking, this program adheres to the same domicile model as someone who's pursuing 4 years of UVA and all the costs the state pays when someone goes to UVA for 4 years, or Radford, or VMI. This program, the cost
One of those is a
the cost to the state for that 4-year duration of identifying that someone is or is not a Virginian is quite different than the cost that's incurred in the state of identifying a Virginian for these programs. The process, in some cases, we've heard is a slight deterrent for some Virginians to say, gosh, that's a lot of work, and I don't have this and that. Are you sure I have to, show these things? And it's a little confusing, particularly for very first generation post-secondary participants. So in the future, some consideration, not this year, but some consideration for a modified process for domicile. Not one that ignores domicile, but one that's a little more streamlined path for the nature of the state's investment. Not an ask today, but perhaps an ask for the next session.
Well, it's comforting to know what the ask will be in the future. Any other comments or questions? If not, thank all of you.